Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Priceless Podcast. Today, again, with an exciting guest. You will hear a little bit more about him in a few seconds, probably. But before we start, I want to say that this podcast is made in partnership with the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups. If you want to send a donation to the European Forum and/or the podcast, you can find all the necessary information in the podcast description. Also, if you would like to listen to the audio version only, you can find it on almost any audio podcast app, not audio, but podcast app that you like of your choice. Just search for The Priceless Podcast. And now we come to the time where we introduce our guest for today. And I have a special guest, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. His name is James Alison, and he's originally from the UK, but he's actually from all over the world. But maybe he'll tell you a little bit more when he introduces himself. So for the beginning, James, thank you so much for accepting this invitation and for being part of this podcast. Welcome to the Priceless Podcast.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm privileged that you would have chosen me. Thank you.
The privilege is all mine, and the viewers who haven't heard about you will probably see in this interview why I'm so excited. But could you, before we start, tell a few words about yourself, introduce yourself, and tell them who you are? Whatever you would like to say about yourself.
Gosh, I'm a priest and a theologian, Catholic priest, a theologian. And I live in Madrid in Spain, having lived in lots of different countries, Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, Mexico, the United States, as well, of course, as my homeland, England. I've been, I've been an out gay man as a priest for a long time. With all sorts of adventures to tell regarding the ups and downs of that, I guess that much of what I've done is done as a theologian and as a preacher has been applying the thought of a French thinker called René Girard, who has a particular understanding of desire and violence, to basic Christian theology. And if you like, my conviction is that if we understand basic Christianity right, then it will be obvious why being open and straightforward about being L, G, B, or T is a direct and organic consequence of that, rather than a piece of special pleading or added on extra, if you like.
When did you figure out that you were gay?
Oh, when I was 9, I was told by another boy at school, as one was in those days, what a queer was. And in those days, queer was not a chic word as it is now. In those days, queer was a very nasty word. And I instantly knew that I was one. And in fact, it seems bizarre to say so. At this, I was almost instantly thrilled that there was a word to describe people like me, and also utterly shocked and lost, because I knew thereafter that it would mean that I was basically lost. There would be no warm receiving place amongst the adults in my life. In other words, that everything would have to be hidden and. That started age 9. So from 9 until I was 18, I was living a lie, trying to work out how to pretend, how to survive, all those things. I finally came out when I was 18. but not because I was, if you like, confident, but because I knew I had to be honest, even though I had no basis of confidence. Here we're talking about the 60s, the late 60s and 70s. So we're not talking about, not talking about very recent times. So yes, very, a complicated period.
You said that you were thrilled when you were 9 and you found out that there was a word for what you are. What made you feel thrilled?
Oh, well, I'd fallen in love with another boy. And so there was this huge, amazing feeling of being in love and not really understanding what it was all about and not having any words for it and realizing that here was something that was good and that was wonderful. And that, I wanted to last forever. When you're in love with someone, the one thing you most want is to be with that person forever. And I realized that other people didn't feel the same way, and I was having to sort of try to learn what other people were like and why they were like that, and didn't really understand it all. So when at last there was a word that there were people like me, even though it was an awful word, it was kind of, it's not simply there's something utterly mysterious. When you know that there's a word for something, it means that in one sense you're not the only one. So it was very odd, because it was simultaneously a relief to discover that you are something, and also the awareness that means that you're being launched over an abyss.
Mm. And then you decided to become a priest. What motivated you to become a priest?
There was a long route between the realization of being gay and becoming a priest. I mean, first of all, when I was 12 or 13, I fell in love. This was in another school with another boy, and it happened that this boy was a Catholic. And so I began to work out, because I was from a very conservative evangelical family. And I don't know whether your audience, I imagine your audience is aware of these things, but very often the rigidity of teaching can be even stronger and harsher in the evangelical world than in the Catholic world. And the notion of being an abomination and everything being according to biblical law and hell being very much round the corner was very, very strong. So the realization that there was something warmer and more relaxed, I think, about the relationship between God and creation, as shown by my Catholic friend, was the beginnings of my conversion to Catholicism. So eventually, I became a Catholic when I was 18, and so that was the beginnings of my route towards joining the Dominicans and becoming a priest. So let's remember that this was the late 80s, the late 70s, very beginning of the 80s. So it's worthwhile remembering that the church at that time was curiously in quite a similar place to it where it is now. Now with Francis, in one sense, well, we've moved ahead now, but at the beginning of Francis, it was as though we had gone back to the end of Paul VI. We hadn't yet had the 35 years of going backwards, which were given us by John Paul. So people's presumptions at the end of the 70s and beginning of 80s was that we would be moving on, we would be becoming more honest and open in this sphere, amongst others. That discussion would happen. Instead of which, with the election of John Paul II, we had basically a massive, break put on everything. A whole lot of things were forbidden to be talked about. So things became much, much, much more difficult. And that took several years to sink in. So it wasn't until the mid-80s that had really begun to kick in, by which time I was already a member of the Dominicans. But so So yes, I accepted that I was some sort of defective straight person, which is how gay people were supposed to think of themselves. And I thought, well, I don't have any option but to join a religious order. I was open with my superiors, and at that period, so in the early 80s, these things could be talked about really quite honestly. It was only later that things really started to become difficult again, when everybody got frightened of this, and it became a real, taboo subject. So you had this strange sense of going backwards. So yes, that was where I was in the early to mid 80s. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned now that that you were talking about this. I suppose it was actually after the I don't know the word in English, Second Concilium?
Second Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council.
Vatican Council, where the church started to open up much more. So was that the reason that things were going so well in the 70s?
I don't know whether they were going so well, but certainly there was a sense that things needed to be talked about. There was an optimism about the future of the church. And no doubt, along with it, there were lots of silly things going on. I don't really know, because I was too young to have participated really in what was going on at the time. But yes, generally, there was adult discussions about lots of things that were happening, as well, of course, as we now know, as a very strong backlash on the part of those who really didn't want things to move, or thought that the things that were moving terribly badly and in the wrong direction. So, but yes, this was all part of a mixture of the effervescence of what happened at Vatican II and the backlash to it.
Yeah. So John Paul II was a welcome kind of pope for the people who didn't want this progress, or
absolutely, yeah. He was very much brought in to put on the brakes, which he did. So yes, you had I think what was typical of that kind of person, which is a very warm and publicly friendly face. I think John Paul was an excellent public person, and an absolutely totalitarian attitude towards the church. Great for the public and terrible in terms of church management. And we've seen how catastrophic that was, with the fact that he surrounded himself and allowed himself to be surrounded with some really pretty awful people who were child abusers, cruel. Many of them were gay men with extremely violent lives. So it was a very corrupt court that John Paul had, to which he seems, it's an open question how much he knew actually about how corrupt his court was.
Yeah. Well, it is an interesting topic, but we won't go there now. So how was it for you? You said that you were out. How was it for you to be within this church where there was this huge backlash, and you were gay? You were, as much as I know, you were openly gay towards your colleagues.
Yes, in the religious order, both in England and in the countries that I was in, I was openly gay. This was because, as I said, because this didn't seem to be particularly odd at the time, at least in some of the contexts I was. Though I've later discovered in other contexts it was very odd, because there were, each different culture has its different way of coping with this reality. But remember that there was also at the time, at the beginning of the 80s, from the beginning to the middle to right through the end of the 80s, there was AIDS. AIDS arrived with a bang. So one of the ways in which, gay men, frightened gay men like myself, were out and were able to be as out as possible at the time was by being involved in pastoral work with people with AIDS, which was a mixture of being very frightened for ourselves and longing to help other people in awful situations. So it was also difficult for church authorities to be completely hateful to people who were doing pastoral work with people who were dying. So, if you like, it was a very strong learning space for gay Christians at the time, if you like, being involved in pastoral work with AIDS, because really all the language about being hated by God and being punished by God and all of that came absolutely alive in dealing with this terrible virus and its effects on people's lives and the fact that it killed them. At that time, little was known at first, and then in many countries, for instance in Brazil where I lived, there were hardly condoms available, and certainly not condoms of sufficient strength to be able to cope with anal sex. People were not used to lubricant. People just died incredibly fast. I think 80% of people who were infected died within 5 months of their first opportunistic infection. So it was really a very, very cruel period, but also a place of learning, because you had to fight for your faith, to receive and keep alive the possibility of understanding that God loves us in the midst of all this, and learning and discovering that that is true. It was through interface with people in this situation that I was able to learn a good deal of what I've learned in terms of theology, about the presence of God, about the presence of God in suffering, and other people suffering. So, yes, you couldn't really, the backlash was very strong, but of course AIDS was stronger. And God empowering us to get through AIDS was stronger still. In fact, I think to this day that one of the factors that has meant that my generation, if you like, of gay Christian men, priests, pastors, one of the things that has enabled us not to be squashed, if you like, by church authority and their awful rhetoric and the nonsense they speak, is having lived in the midst of the valley of the shadow of death. I shall walk in the valley of the shadow of death, and I will not fear. Once you've been there and learnt to see and discover God's love in the midst of that, once you've been given faith in the resurrection as your best friends and loved ones die, as you discover that the faith is real, then you also realize how weak and phony the ecclesiastical quackery is that blathers on with its silly definitions and is not really related to real people and really the central matters of God, faith, life, love, and death. So yes, I think there was something incredibly strong in that. I just read a book which is going to come out soon about similar experiences in North America. It's published by a young journalist called Michael O'Loughlin, who's written about gay Catholics at the time of AIDS in the United States. And he brings out something very similar, that actually the dealing with that was so much stronger than even the silly, if you like, the silly attempts to play bureaucratic definitional games. Ultimately, even the top clerics can't fight against that.
Well, one question I have is, you talked about the ups and downs that, your being gay brought to you and being part of the church, what would you mention as the biggest down for you, which was really hard, and what was the best up for you?
Well, I mean, I think that the best up has been fantastic theological education, which I received from Dominicans and from Jesuits between them, which, especially when I then discovered the thought of René Girard, gave me the tools to rethink Christian faith and to begin to re-understand it in a completely orthodox way, but in an entirely new language. So that's been a fantastic up. And then, of course, the many magnificent people who have become sisters and brothers, genuine sisters and brothers who I've met along the way. The downs are, of course, that you have an ecclesiastical mechanism that is basically run by the closet, with a very large proportion of senior clergy who are closeted gay men. And, of course, many of them don't wish to be cruel or nasty at all, but they're not prepared to stand up for what is true. They just want a quiet life, want to be so-called prudent or obedient, don't want to question the teaching of the church, even though they themselves don't live it and know that it's wrong. And then, of course, what's sadder is the number of self-hating and really very tortured homophobic clergy, especially high clergy. There are people who everyone knows are gay, except perhaps themselves. And these are the ones who have the strongest need to punish and to weed out and to attack. And there's something pathetic and awful about that. And the way that those who know about this are unable to call those people out and say, listen, we know why you're doing this. We know why you're talking like this. Now, just go and get some treatment. Get yourself looked after. There's no need for you to be, what do you suggest? These people then go into defending themselves with the Holy Father and the Mother of God and blah, blah, blah. It's a very sad how frequent the figure of the violently self-hating gay clergy person is. I think that almost every seminary, almost every religious house of formation has one at least, and everybody knows that is the person that they have to watch out for. And it's very sad but that's going to stay the way it is until people are able to talk rationally about what is true in this field, rather than playing games, trying to say, oh, well, there is this awful teaching, but we'll dance around it as long as we all pretend together. And if we play nice with each other, it'll be okay. Of course, we can't tell the lay people that it's nonsense, because then we'll be going against the teaching of the church. So we create a nice safe space for ourselves. Except that we can't really create a safe space because there's always one or two self-haters amongst us who are going to try to use this issue. So, it's a system of mutual blackmail, basically, mutual emotional blackmail. And that's awful. What it does is it allows the clergy to live in a completely fake, semi-safe, but not really safe space, just so long as they're not honest with lay people. And that is pure Pharisaism, because it means that they can't reach out and tell the truth to young people who need to be told the truth so that they can grow in good conscience and become sane, balanced adults who are capable of living sane, balanced lives rather than furtive, guilty, etc., etc.
Well, it sounds just, of course, sad, but also so lonely for these people. Like when you can't really live with your truth or come out with your truth, it sounds lonely to me.
Yes, I wonder. Yes, I mean, I guess so. I think that probably varies very much on the degree of, on different personality types. yes, it's certainly not healthy. It's certainly not healthy.
Yeah. Well, there is one thing. When I was growing up and going to church or having friends, there was always this question: what if they knew? Would they
Yep.
still be my friend? And that is also a place of loneliness. And of course, there is a lot of fear and uncertainty. What if they find out? But I know that you are maybe sick and tired of telling this story, but I heard it in another podcast, and I found it very interesting because one of the things that happened to you, because you do openly talk about LGBT people and how the church needs to be affirming, but you also got let's call it a backlash from a bishop who, I don't know how it's called within the church, excuse my ignorance, but you got fired.
Oh yes. Oh, well,
and then you got a very interesting call. Could you kind of tell the story? What happened?
Yes. Well, I since 1995, I've been looking for. I'm a priest. I'm not a member of a religious order any longer, and I've been looking for a way to be involved, to belong in some way, to have a stranger, to have a superior. And that's terribly difficult because, of course, it would be very difficult for a superior to have me as their subject, while being able to imagine that I might be telling the truth, because off the record they know that I am telling the truth, but on the record they might have to shut me down. So I've tried to sort this out. I've tried to talk to archbishops. I've tried to talk to cardinals about this, but they're often very friendly off the record, but aren't able to do anything. But one of them, a very high-ranking cardinal at the time, said, the next time you move to a new city, reach out to the bishop and see whether he can sort it out. So when I moved to a city in Brazil, I did that. I entered into correspondence with, sent a copy of my book, Faith Beyond Resentment, translated into Portuguese. No reply. And a year later, I found out that the bishop, the cardinal, wanted to get in touch with me. I didn't know why, but so I went along. And it turned out that I'd given an interview in the local newspaper at Pride time. And although I hadn't realized this, they had put my interview on the same page as an op-ed by him, in which he'd, I think, been making some criticisms about Pride. And he thought that I'd done this deliberately, that I'd been trying to make a fool of him. So, in fact, I had no idea. I hadn't even been in the country when the newspaper had rung me up and done the interview. So I had really no idea of where it was going to be and anything like that. And eventually he could see that was true, that I wasn't making it up, that there'd been no deliberate thing. But then he said, "Well, okay, so now how do I remove you from the clergy?" That was his only attitude towards me. And of course, in the Catholic setup, you can't remove somebody from being a priest without cause. Either they have to have done something really bad, criminal, abuse somebody, or for instance, get married, or they have to ask for it themselves. But because it's a sacrament, it can't be done automatically. Well, anyhow, so he couldn't get rid of me easily. But then eventually he found a change in canon law that allowed him to do it automatically without my having done anything. So he went through that system and sent it to Rome and got me removed. And I got sent a letter in Latin saying, a whole lot of incomprehensible things, but theoretically in the name of the Holy Father. In nominem summum pontifico, I don't know, all of that stuff in Latin. Anyhow, basically saying that I was not to preach or celebrate or hear confessions or anything like that. So I was in the official language. I think they used to call it laicized, reduced to the lay status. Now I think they try not to be so rude to lay people, and now they call it dismissal from the clerical status. So when I received this, I was pretty upset, as you can imagine. It was yet another hierarchical attempt to say, you are nothing, you are nobody. But so I showed it to my former novice master, who was a bishop, and he said, "Oh, James, pay no attention. These people, if they were halfway sensible, they'd get you on board to try and help work out how we get forward with this." So he said, "But don't write to the Pope, because it'll never get through. But I, in other words, he will ask the Pope for a private audience and ask him to sort it out." And so he did. It took a bit of time for him to get his private audience, but he did. He took a letter from me. I explained the situation in the letter, and he handed it to the Pope. And afterwards he rang me up and said, "Hey, I've had my meeting. It went very well. He didn't seem upset with what I talked to him about, so I'm sure something will happen. Let's see what happens." I thought, great. So I've appealed this crazy thing in Latin. I said to the Pope in the letter, "Listen, this thing in your name is so different from the things that you say in your own name that I don't know which of the two of you to believe. The one who says, make a noise, go to the peripheries, do things, be brave, don't be too worried by what the Vatican says, or the one in Latin saying you are a null person." Well, 2 months later, I was sitting in my flat in Madrid, and the phone rings with a hidden number, and the voice said, "This is Pope Francis." And so I said, "You're kidding." I said, "Really?" And he said, "No, just kidding, son." in Spanish, he says, "Soy el Papa Francisco." "En serio?" "No, hijo, en broma." Just kidding. But it was him, it was recognizably his voice. He'd read the letter, so he went through it, and he said, "I want you to walk with great interior freedom, following in the spirit of Jesus, and I give you the power of the keys. Do you understand? I give you the power of the keys." So I said, yes, I understood, even though I didn't. But it's something important when the successor of Peter is talking about keys, because that's something to do with what Peter does. So,
yeah.
But later, I talked about this, and people said, well, A, it obviously meant he's treating me as a priest, and B, he was giving me jurisdiction to hear confessions and permission to preach. So effectively, he was treating as null the decree of his congregation for clergy, and basically saying, be an adult, get on with it. So, yes, it was very encouraging.
Yeah, I believe
so. It still hasn't resolved, if you like. I still don't belong to anything. I still, it's like he said, okay, I'm giving you wings, fly. But still, there's no tree that I can yet land in. But maybe that will happen one day. But basically, he set me free to exercise a ministry. So that's what I'm trying to do.
So you're still waiting for the flood of, I don't know, how would we call this? Whatever is flooding the church to recede, so you can find a tree.
Yes, I think when their fear and their shame goes down sufficiently, that they're not too frightened to talk honestly. I think that's where we're at the moment. And all over the place, there are patches are breaking out all over the place. Bishops are talking to lay people. Lay people finally are just getting on with life, being really quite confident and straightforward, and organizing groups, making themselves known to the bishops. The bishops are often too frightened, but little by little, even quite conservative bishops are saying, yes, this is really too silly. Let's see if we can talk about this in a more grown-up way. So I noticed that, as I'm sure you did, in the wake of the Vatican responsum on the question of blessing same-sex couples. I remember the first time that they came out with the logic that's behind that statement, which was in 1986. It terrified everybody. Scarcely anybody dared to speak out against it, because they couldn't face up to the logic of what it was saying at the time. It was simply trying to lock people into this is undiscussable, this is the truth, this is from God, we say so, this can't be talked about. And yet, when this came out 35 years later, this responsum, the same logic is behind it. And everybody's able to see this is really not a suitable way to talk about grown-up people. This is not an adult form of conversation. No. You are stuck, you, the congregation, are stuck within a definition that is a prioristic, that takes no account of what we actually know about the people involved. So this is not an adult. In other words, the backlash against them was much, much stronger, I think, than they had expected. And that is because ordinary lay people, and indeed even a good number of priests and bishops, are just not prepared to put up with this way of talking any longer. In other words, at last, people are no longer frightened by the old definition. They realize that the old definition is false. But we still need to say that, because it still exercises too much power over people. But little by little, I think, its capacity to shame people into silence is being washed away. And that's what that's what gives me, is one of the things which gives me hope, is seeing how straightforwardly people were able to react and saying, no, that's not an adult and sensible way of talking about these people at all, and it just doesn't correspond to what we know of their life. So, yeah, that's the...
Yeah. Can you point out a few, or just say a few points out of this document? So I don't think that all of us who are watching this podcast know what it is saying exactly. I mean, I read some parts of it, but maybe if you could point out a few things that you find ridiculous.
The document which came out, it was only a one-word document in one sense, because the only word in it was negative, which was asked, it asked itself a question, and it was probably a conservative German bishop or cardinal who asked it the question deliberately so that it would give a negative answer. Is it permissible to bless same-sex couples? And the answer was negative, it's not. But it then gave a justification for itself, for its negative answer, and its justification was God can't bless a sin, and that same-sex couples are, by the nature of their sexual activity, engaging in sin, and therefore that's why they can't be blessed. And what's behind that? What's behind the understanding of sin? And that's that they made references to the documents, including the 1986 document, which is where this logic was set out. And the logic, which is their logic, is derived from the understanding that all human beings are theoretically, by virtue of our biology, our visible biology, are intrinsically heterosexual. In other words, we have the plumbing that is proper for reproductive. We have the for reproductive sex, and therefore that there is such a thing as a good sexual act, which is one in which the right pieces of plumbing come together and perform an act that is open to procreation and is between married people. Okay, so that's between married people of opposite sex, and that is something that is good. And anything that is not that is to some extent ordered away from it. So, for instance, a straight couple using contraception is in some way ordering the sexual act away from its proper finality. So that's a disordered sexual act. But if it's between two people of the same sex, then of course it couldn't possibly achieve its procreative function. So it's intrinsically disordered. It's disordered of its very self. And then you have to say, what? The people who are doing this are not trying to have a baby. They know. I mean, if a gay couple is having sex in order to have a baby, this is not so much a moral problem as an intellectual problem. They haven't understood how reproduction works. It's not that they're failing to do something. They're not. But so the church says, no. Even the tendency to want to have sex in this way is objectively disordered. The tendency itself is objectively disordered, which means that a gay or lesbian person is a straight person because they have the body that is capable of marital sex, but they suffer from some sort of objective disorder such that they typically want to do something that is intrinsically disordered. Now, please notice what this means. They're saying that what a gay or lesbian person is just in their body, the plumbing, the external plumbing, determines exactly who they are, and that if their desire is in some way different from this, then their desire is disordered. So a gay or lesbian person is, if you like, an objectively disordered straight person, and that therefore there's no possible justification either for their desire or for the acts that they might have, which is why any sort of coupling between them, however loving and friendly and all of that, would still be covering something that is objectively sinful. So that's their teaching. Now, in one sense, the moment you see it, you say, well, but that's gaslighting. That's saying to people, listen, we know who you are more than you do. We are saying that what you call a sexual orientation, which you have discovered over time as being part of who you are, is not in fact a sexual orientation. It's an attraction, a same-sex attraction that is a disorder, rather as anorexia might be a disorder or something else, kleptomania might be a disorder. And that it's only in as far as you fight against that and deny it that you are really who you are. Whereas what we have typically discovered is, after no doubt a difficult period growing up, we actually discover, actually this is not a disordered part of a heterosexual me, this is just part of who I am. And it's neither a particularly bad nor a particularly good part of who I am, it's just an ordinary part of who I am. And furthermore, as I accept it, so I am able to become more human in my relationships with other people. I'm able to learn how to love other people better, how to be with them better. I'm learning how to be able to take responsibility for my relationships. I'm learning how to be able not to be so frightened and furtive. And I'm ultimately able to learn to be sexually responsible and even chaste in relationship with someone else, so that I'm able to choose someone and he's able to choose me or she's able to choose me and we're able to build something together. In other words, we discover that it's part of what makes us able to be human. Now that's what they deny, that's what their system denies. And it's a deduction from a medieval notion derived from Aristotelian thought concerning the finality of the sexual act. And of course, what it can't cope with is the realization that in fact, a sexual orientation, which now neuroscientists, biologists, people who study brain chemistry, etc., understand to be something that just is hardwired in us. It's not the result of hedonistic thought patterns or us deciding to do something bad when we're teenagers. They understand that this is hardwired. This is like left-handedness. It's hardwired into people. It's not a flippant choice made at a young age. That is as bodily, because as chemical, as neurological, as the visible bits of plumbing. To pretend that the visible bits of plumbing are bodily, but the orientation isn't, is simply a misunderstanding of what bodily means. And that, if you like, it's not that our sex is gay or lesbian, but that we are. It's part of who we are. And that's, as it were, that's not, if you like, to lock us into an identity. It's much more like a platform from which we become more in a whole lot of other spheres. It's not a trap. It's a beginning. It's certainly not a closed-down identity. There's no such thing as limits on you through being gay or lesbian, but it's part of what enables you to develop and become whoever you are in whatever field you're advancing. Intellectual, moral, personal, creative, dynamic, etc., etc. So, that's the difficulty. The difficulty is that in order to protect its moral teaching, the Church needs a fake definition of who gay and lesbian people are. It needs us to be defined negatively from a presupposition of intrinsic corporal heterosexuality. And one of the reasons for that is that argument in the Middle Ages seemed to match with how they understood the Bible. But we now know that the Bible passages that are used against gay people don't mean anything to do with what we call homosexuality. And curiously, at this stage, even the Vatican Biblical Commission realizes that it doesn't have anything to do. In other words, when it comes to the biblical material, the Catholic Church has actually got increasingly relaxed about its realization that these passages cannot be read in this way properly. That is bad Bible reading. So they have to try and stick with what's called this natural law definition, and which is, it would be like saying, if God had wanted humans to fly, he would have given us wings. He didn't give us wings, therefore he doesn't want us to fly. Therefore, anyone who flies in an aeroplane or a helicopter is doing something that is against God's law. Okay. I mean, it's as realistic as that. Once we've discovered aerodynamics, we discovered the possibilities of humans flying, not as something against human nature, but as extensions to what humans, by our nature, have been able to discover how to do. Yes, I think the key question, and I think that many of us realize this, is that we all, as young people, have struggles of conscience in which we are working out: is it just that I am this way, or is it that I or someone else has done something wrong that I am this way? And at this stage, there is no longer any evidence to suggest that anyone has done anything wrong that you or I should be this way. It's certainly not a parent's fault. It's not some youthful trauma. It's something that's hardwired. It's some mixture of genetic, neurological, hormonal, and environmental factors. But it's certainly not anybody's fault. 1. 2. The second thing, and it's certainly not something that you or I chose as part of an act of youthful wickedness, where we thought to ourselves, how can I screw up my life and everything to the maximum possible extent and make life really difficult for myself while having guilty fun? I know. Why don't I choose to be gay? This is nonsense. It doesn't happen. Even if we tried, we wouldn't be able to, just as straight people don't choose to be straight. This is something which happens. We discover ourselves over time. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is that more and more, as we've become more historically conscious about who we are, we've been able to see that there has been an historical progress over the last 150 years as people have become more visible. So scientists have been able to begin to ask non-moralistic questions about us, rather than in the old days where criminal, psychological, moral questions were, what's the problem with these people? Now the question is, I wonder what it is that makes these people tick. Now that we know that there's no Though, of course, as in the case of all of us, as in the case of straight people, we are screwed up in how we live it out. And we have to learn to become less screwed up as we live it out. And that normally and healthily, the way of being humanized in this is a learning process. And it includes learning how not to be possessive, how to be honest, how to be responsible, how to love in general. So, since the 1950s, it really is interesting that the medicine has been pretty clear since then. And it's only got clearer since, as we've discovered, as DNA was discovered, as neuroscience has advanced, and we've begun to discover a whole lot of interesting things. And of course, the science has a long way to go. But the key question was, is there any psychopathology that is intrinsic to being gay or lesbian? And even in the 1950s, the answer came back clear. None has been detected. Which means we are as screwed up as everybody else, not more or less screwed up than everybody else. In other words, we're human. Our learning process has to work the same way, humanly. And that, of course, is what is, in one sense, is what was at the heart of the row which came out with the responsum. It's because so many people have worked out that is true, that same-sex couples recognize that their married life is a blessing and seek to bless God for it with their friends by having liturgies of blessing. And that, of course, those people who know them, including the priests and bishops who know them, think, yes, this makes perfect sense. These people are blessing each other. They have become a blessing to their friends. Let us bless God for this. We don't know exactly what kind of sacramentality this relationship has. Maybe it's the same as in straight-sex weddings, straight couple weddings. Maybe not. That's a question for the future. But that it is clearly a sign of blessing, as we have learnt who these people are for each other, well, yes. And it was the attempt to stop that learning process, if you like, that the responsum weighed in. I was saying, no, you can't learn anything true about who you are because it's all wrong. And of course, people say, no, that's just not a useful way. We have accompanied people. We know too many people in this sphere. The ability to speak honestly about this can't be closed down by decrees from on high. And no, you, the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, don't know more about us than we know about ourselves. You claim to know more about us from a 13th century piece of deduction. You don't. This is not from God. This is the tradition of men, and you are using it to make void the word of God. Jesus talks about that. You stick to the tradition of men and you make void the word of God. So.
Yeah. Thank you for these words. I hope that what you just said can be of great encouragement to the people who listen to this podcast or watch it. Thank you for this part. I'm looking forward to the second one. Thank you, dear viewers, for watching this part. You can find the second part next week for our next episode. Thank you for being with us and listening to James's story. As I said in the beginning, all the links, James Alison wrote a lot of interesting books, and I will put the links below in the podcast description, so please go and check them out. Don't forget, this podcast is made in partnership with the European Forum and the Priceless Podcast. So if you want to support this podcast to continue, I would encourage you to give a donation towards the podcast, or you can also give a donation to the European Forum. So this was it for today. Oh, I almost forgot, the audio version you can find on any podcast app by searching the Priceless Podcast. So till next Monday, and for now, all I can say is bye, everyone.